The phone rang in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, the kind of hour that carries no warnings. I was standing at my kitchen counter, a mug cooling between my hands, when the vibration skidded across the wood like a living thing. I almost ignored it. Unknown number. I'd trained myself to let the past go to voicemail. But then the ringing stopped and started again, sharper this time, impatient. Before I answered, my body reacted first. My shoulders locked. My mouth went dry. I hadn't heard his voice in years yet. My spine recognized it the way skin remembers a burn. "Don't hang up," he said, calm and familiar, as if we'd spoken yesterday. "We need to talk." He didn't say my name. He never had to. He spoke like someone who still owned the right to interrupt my life, like someone who believed silence meant obedience, not absence. 5 years disappeared in a single breath. The kitchen felt smaller, the air heavier. He told me there were family matters. He told me my presence was required. He told me I needed to come home before Christmas. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask. When the call ended, I realized my hands were shaking hard enough to rattle the mug. I stood there listening to the quiet rush back into the room, knowing one thing with absolute clarity. He hadn't called because he missed me. He had called because something was breaking, and he thought I was the piece he could still force back into place. I didn't call him back. I set the phone face down on the counter and watched the screen go dark. For a long moment, I focused on the sound of my own breathing, steadying myself the way I'd learned to do in rooms where my voice had once made things worse. I had built a life around not hearing that voice again. Changed numbers, changed addresses, changed the way I introduced myself to strangers so nothing tied me back to that house, those holidays, that version of me. And still, one call was enough to make the past feel close enough to touch. I reminded myself where I was, my apartment, my city, my rules. I had not been dragged back into anything yet. He could demand all he wanted. Demands only worked when you were trapped. I was not. The woman standing in that kitchen was not the girl who had left in the dark with a car half full of things she could carry. I was older now. Not brittle older, not tired older. Sharper, calmer. I'd learned how to read contracts and people, how to hear what wasn't being said. I had learned that distance could be a form of strength if you used it correctly. And I had learned that men like him only reached out when the ground beneath them started to shift. I poured the coffee down the sink, rinsed the mug, and set it upside down to dry. Simple motions, deliberate. I needed my hands to do something useful while my mind caught up. He had said it was family business. He had said it was urgent. He had said I couldn't keep pretending I didn't belong to them. That was how he always framed things. As if belonging were a debt. As if family were something you owed, regardless of how much it cost you. I thought about the way he used rooms, how he filled them without raising his voice, how conversations bent toward him without anyone noticing they'd been pushed. He had mastered the art of appearing reasonable while making everyone else feel small. That talent didn't vanish with time. It only got more refined. I walked to the window and looked down at the street, the steady movement of people going nowhere important. Somewhere behind me, the phone buzzed again. A text this time, short, direct. "Be here by the 20th. We need to finalize things. Finalize things." The phrase landed wrong. It carried the weight of paperwork, signatures, decisions made in advance of my consent. It carried the echo of conversations I hadn't been invited into. I had learned painfully that my absence had never stopped them from making plans that included my name. I didn't reply. Instead, I sat at the small desk by the window and opened my laptop. Habit. When something didn't make sense, I didn't argue with it. I examined it. Years ago, I would have reacted emotionally scrambling to prove myself innocent of whatever he was implying. Now I asked a different question. What had changed? People like him thrived on predictability. They relied on the belief that fear would keep others in line. The last thing they wanted was someone who had stepped outside the pattern and learned how to watch from a distance. If he was willing to break 5 years of silence to risk reopening wounds he'd never acknowledged, it meant the situation was no longer under his control. I closed the laptop without logging in. Not yet. There was time for facts later. First, I needed to understand the shape of the trap. I hadn't spoken his name out loud since the night I left. Saying it felt like giving him space in my mouth again. He was my stepfather on paper, the man my mother married when I was young enough to believe adults always knew what they were doing. He came with a smile that never reached his eyes and a talent for turning comfort into currency. Under his roof, holidays were performances, not celebrations. Christmas was about tradition, about appearances, about who sat where and who spoke when. It was also the night everything changed. I didn't let myself go there yet. Memory could wait. I had learned that too. You didn't survive by reliving the worst moments on demand. You survived by deciding when they were useful. I paced the apartment, noticing details that grounded me. The chipped corner of the bookshelf I'd built myself. The stack of files on the table from work organized and labeled. Evidence of a life that functioned without his approval. Outside, a bus hissed to a stop. Doors opening and closing with mechanical indifference. The world kept moving, unaware of how one voice could try to pull you backward. The text buzzed again. He added my mother this time, looping her into the thread like a pressure point. She hadn't called. She never did when things mattered. Her silence had always been quieter than his control, but just as heavy. I imagined her sitting somewhere, familiar hands folded, telling herself this was necessary, that it was easier to smooth things over than to ask hard questions. She had been very good at that. I turned the phone off. That was when the certainty settled in. He wasn't reaching out because he wanted me back. He was reaching out because he needed something only I could give, something he couldn't take without my presence. Whatever it was, it had to be official, visible, clean enough to survive scrutiny, which meant it was already dirty. I sat down and made a decision that surprised me with how calm it felt. I would not refuse him outright. Not yet. Refusal closed doors, silence opened them. I would let him think I was considering his demand. I would let him talk. People revealed far more when they believed you were listening. Outside, the light began to fade, afternoon tipping toward evening. I thought of all the Christmases I'd spent holding my breath, waiting for them to be over. The decorations, the forced smiles, the unspoken rules. He had always believed I left because I was weak, because I couldn't handle the pressure. He had never considered the possibility that I left to learn how pressure worked. When I finally turned the phone back on, there were no new messages. He was waiting. I smiled to myself, a small, private thing. Let him wait. I would answer him soon. I would hear him out. And when I did, it wouldn't be as the person he remembered. It would be as someone who understood leverage, who knew that the quietest moves often had the sharpest consequences. He thought this call was about family. I knew better. This was about power, and for the first time in years, I was the one who had it. I hadn't planned to think about that Christmas again. I never did. Memories like that were best kept sealed, taken out only when you needed proof of why you'd left. But after his call, the past didn't knock. It walked straight in and sat down like it belonged there. That Christmas had started with hope, which was its own kind of mistake. I'd come home believing time might have softened things, that adulthood might finally earn me a different seat at the table. My mother had sounded almost warm on the phone, telling me everyone would be together, that it would be nice to have the family under one roof again. She said family the way people say weather, as if it were something that simply happened to you. The house was already full when I arrived, not loud, not joyful, full in the way a room feels crowded with furniture you're afraid to bump into. Everything was polished and carefully placed, from the wreath on the door to the gifts lined up beneath the tree, each one wrapped in the same paper, each tag written in the same precise hand. It looked perfect. It felt rehearsed. I remember standing in the entryway, my coat still on, realizing no one had asked how the drive was. They noticed I was there, but they didn't notice me. My stepfather nodded once from across the room, already mid-conversation, his voice carrying easily over everyone else's. My mother smiled quickly, the kind of smile that didn't interrupt what she was doing. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was being sensitive. That day passed in small corrections, comments disguised as jokes, reminders about how things were done here. I was talked over, redirected, gently repositioned like a chair that didn't quite fit the layout. Each moment was minor enough to dismiss on its own. Together they formed a pattern I'd learned to recognize too late. The holiday ritual came after dinner. Not the usual kind. no movies or board games. This was something my stepfather insisted on, a tradition he said brought people closer, made them honest. It involved heat confinement and the expectation that everyone would endure it together. Opting out was framed as weakness. So I didn't. We filed into the space he'd prepared, towels folded neatly, rules laid out with the same tone he used for business meetings. He took his place like a host, like a man certain of his authority. My mother sat beside him. Others followed without question. I hesitated for a moment before joining them, aware of how small that hesitation felt, how visible. The air grew heavy quickly. Conversation thinned, then sharpened. He talked about responsibility, about loyalty, about how families protected their own. It sounded like a sermon delivered to a captive audience. At some point I spoke, not loudly, not defiantly. I asked a simple question about something he'd mentioned earlier, something that didn't quite add up. The shift was instant. He turned toward me slowly, his expression calm, in a way that felt dangerous. The room went quiet, not because anyone told it to, but because everyone sensed something they didn't want to name. He corrected me, his voice smooth, his words precise. When I tried to clarify, he stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the sharp edge of his aftershave. The contact was quick, almost casual, not enough to draw attention, not enough to leave a mark anyone would feel compelled to comment on, just enough to silence me. Just enough to remind me where I stood. No one moved. That was the moment that stayed with me. Not what he did, but what everyone else didn't do. My mother stared at the floor. Someone cleared their throat. The conversation resumed around the space I suddenly occupied, as if I were no longer fully present. The message was clear. This was not a disruption. This was a correction. I sat there for a few minutes after that, long enough to understand something had ended. Not the holiday, not the gathering, my place in that family. I excused myself without drama, blaming the heat, the long drive, the need for air. No one followed. No one asked if I was okay. Later, my mother would say she assumed I needed a moment. That assumption would carry her through years. Alone in my old room, I looked around at things that no longer felt like mine. Childhood photos arranged like exhibits. Decorations chosen to preserve an image, not a memory. I closed the door quietly and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter drifting up from below. They were fine. They would always be fine. I didn't confront him. I didn't demand an apology. I didn't explain myself to my mother. Shock has a way of narrowing your options. Survival had taught me that sometimes the safest response was silence, not because you had nothing to say, but because you finally understood it wouldn't matter. That night, lying awake, I made a decision that didn't feel dramatic at the time. It felt practical. I would leave. Not immediately, not in a rush. I would leave in a way that required no permission and invited no debate. I would take myself somewhere I could hear my own thoughts again. The next morning, the house buzzed with holiday energy plans and schedules overlapping in a way that made it easy to disappear between them. I moved through the rooms with a clarity that surprised me. I packed lightly. I left behind things that tied me to a version of myself they preferred. I wrote a note that said just enough to prevent questions, but not enough to invite conversation. When I walked out, no one noticed. That realization landed harder than anything else. I paused by the door, waiting for a voice to call my name, for footsteps behind me. Nothing. I stepped into the cold air and closed the door quietly, as if noise might remind them I existed. Driving away the road, stretching ahead, I felt fear, yes, but beneath it was something steadier. Relief, the kind that comes when you stop pretending. I didn't know yet where I was going or how long I would stay gone. I only knew that whatever that house represented, it was no longer home. Home was supposed to be where you were safe to speak to, asked to exist without flinching. That Christmas taught me a lesson I would spend years unpacking. Silence doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it means agreement. And I had finally decided I would no longer agree. I didn't wake up that morning with a plan. I woke up with a certainty. It was still dark outside, the kind of quiet hour where the house holds its breath before pretending to be warm and welcoming again. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the low hum of the heating system and the distant sound of someone shifting downstairs. My heart wasn't racing. That was the strange part. There was no panic, no rush of thoughts, just a clear, settled understanding that if I stayed, something in me would calcify and never soften again. I sat up slowly, careful not to make noise, as if silence itself were a form of camouflage. The room felt smaller than it had the night before, as though the walls had leaned in while I slept. Every object looked like it belonged to someone else. I realized then how long I'd been a guest in my own childhood. I stood and began to move through the room, not packing, yet just touching things. The edge of the desk where I'd done homework years earlier. The bookshelf my stepfather had insisted be organized by height instead of sentiment. The framed photo of my mother and me, before she learned how to smile without her eyes. I didn't feel nostalgia, I felt inventory. Packing was quick once I started, not because I didn't own much, but because most of it wasn't coming with me. I took clothes I could wear anywhere, shoes that didn't ask questions, documents I'd learned the hard way to keep close. I left behind keepsakes that tied me to expectations I no longer planned to meet. Childhood trophies, dresses chosen for me, things that belonged to the story they told about who I was supposed to be. I didn't write a long note. I knew better. Long notes invited rebuttals, explanations, rewriting. I left a few lines that sounded responsible, temporary, harmless. I said I had to leave early. I said I'd call later. I said nothing about why. The house was quiet when I stepped into the hallway. I passed my mother's door and paused, my hand hovering inches from the wood. I imagined knocking, imagined her sleepy confusion, imagined the conversation that would follow. Her concern would arrive late, diluted by practicality. She would ask me to be patient. She would ask me not to make trouble. She would ask me to understand. Understanding had cost me enough. I lowered my hand and kept walking. Downstairs, the living room lights were off, the tree glowing softly in the corner like a stage set waiting for actors. Wrapped gifts sat untouched, their perfection suddenly absurd. I moved past them, past the kitchen where every surface gleamed, past the space where laughter would return in a few hours as if nothing had happened. At the door, I slipped on my coat and picked up my bag. The lock clicked softly behind me, the sound final in a way that surprised me. Outside, the cold hit my face like a wake-up call. I inhaled deeply, the air sharp and clean, and for the first time since arriving, my chest didn't feel tight. My car sat at the edge of the driveway, dusted lightly with frost. It wasn't impressive. It didn't belong to anyone's idea of success. But it started when I turned the key, and that was enough. As I pulled away, the house remained dark and still in the rearview mirror. No lights flipped on, no door opened. They slept through my leaving. That fact followed me down the road mile after mile. I had expected anger, maybe guilt. What I felt instead was a hollow clarity. I had been quieter than I realized, easier to overlook. My presence had been decorative, not essential. The road was mostly empty, the sky just beginning to pale at the edges. I drove with the radio off the hum of the tires, a steady companion. Somewhere past the outskirts of town, my hands loosened on the steering wheel. The tension I hadn't known I was carrying began to drain away, leaving a shaky kind of calm in its place. I didn't head somewhere familiar. Familiar was dangerous. Familiar pulled you back into patterns you were trying to escape. I chose a place where I knew I could stay without questions, without expectations. Safety mattered more than comfort now. By the time the sun rose fully, I was already hours away. I stopped once for gas and coffee, standing under harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look equally tired and real. No one recognized me. No one cared where I'd come from. The anonymity felt like permission. When I finally parked and stepped into the borrowed space that would become my temporary refuge, exhaustion hit me all at once. I slept without dreams, the kind of sleep that feels like a system reboot. When I woke, my phone was buzzing. The messages came in clusters. First confusion, then irritation, then concern framed as inconvenience. Where did you go? Why didn't you say anything? You can't just leave like that. Christmas plans are ruined. My mother's name appeared among them, her words carefully chosen, asking if I was safe, reminding me that people were worried. Not one message asked what had happened. That was when the truth settled fully into place. They didn't miss me. They missed the version of the day that included me. My role, not my well-being. I didn't respond right away. I read each message once then, again noting the patterns, the absence of curiosity, the urgency to restore order. It confirmed what I already knew. Leaving hadn't shocked them because they had never really seen me there. Over the next few days, I began to disappear in smaller ways. I delayed responses. I kept answers vague. I stopped volunteering details. Each boundary felt awkward at first, like learning to write with your non-dominant hand. But it got easier. With every unanswered call, with every muted notification, I felt a little more solid. I told myself this wasn't punishment, it was protection. I wasn't trying to teach them a lesson. I was teaching myself how to survive without waiting for permission to exist. At night alone in that borrowed space, I thought about the girl who had sat in that overheated room and gone quiet. I understood her better now. Silence had been her way of staying alive. Leaving was simply the next step. I made myself a promise, then one I didn't speak out loud because it didn't need witnesses. I would not return to that house without leverage. I would not re-enter that family dynamic unless I could stand in it without shrinking. And if that meant never going back at all, I would accept that too. They would tell themselves a story about why I left, that I was dramatic, ungrateful, too sensitive. People always preferred stories that absolved them of responsibility. I couldn't control that. What I could control was what came next. As the days passed and the messages slowed, replaced by a tense quiet, I felt something unfamiliar take root. Not confidence. Not yet. But resolve. The kind that grows when you realize the worst has already happened and you're still standing. They thought I had run away in the dark, overwhelmed and afraid. What they didn't understand was that I had walked out into that darkness on purpose. And in doing so, I had given myself the one thing that house never offered, a future that didn't require me to stay silent. They thought I would fail quietly. That was the unspoken belief hovering over every unanswered call and delayed message in the months after I left. I could hear it in the tone of the few emails my mother sent, careful and brittle, asking if I was managing and reminding me there was always a place for me if I needed help. Help in her vocabulary meant returning to the version of my life she could explain to others. It never occurred to them that I might build something they couldn't oversee. I didn't build anything impressive at first. There was no dramatic transformation, no sudden success that would have made a good story at their dinner table. I rented a small place in a city where no one knew my name or my history. The walls were thin, the furniture second-hand, the windows stubbornly drafty in winter. It wasn't comfortable. It was safe. For the first time in years, I could come home without bracing myself. I took work that paid the bills and asked nothing else of me. Jobs where I could show up, do what was required, and leave without carrying anyone's expectations on my back. I learned how much energy I had been wasting just trying to stay unobtrusive. Without that constant effort, my mind felt sharper, more curious. I started noticing things again. At night when the city quieted and the loneliness crept in, I studied. Not because I had a grand plan, but because learning gave me something solid to hold on to. I took classes that interested me, then classes that scared me a little. Systems, regulations, processes that governed how decisions were made behind closed doors. I discovered I had an instinct for patterns, for spotting where something didn't line up the way it should. It felt like learning the language I'd heard spoken my entire childhood without ever being taught the grammar. I didn't tell my family about any of it. Silence had become a boundary, and I guarded it carefully. Every holiday I spent alone reinforced my resolve. It wasn't easy. There were nights when I wondered if I was proving their assumptions right, nights when the quiet felt less like freedom and more like exile. But each time that thought surfaced, I remembered how easily my presence had been overlooked, how little my pain had mattered when it disrupted their peace. The first person who noticed what I was becoming wasn't family. It was someone I worked with, someone who watched the way I approached problems and asked why I always wanted to see the underlying structure instead of the surface explanation. She didn't frame it as praise. She framed it as curiosity. Have you ever thought about doing more than this? That question stayed with me. I began to lean into the work that required precision and patience. I volunteered for tasks others avoided, the ones that involved sorting through old records and inconsistent reports. There was something deeply satisfying about bringing order to chaos, about uncovering the truth buried beneath layers of convenience and assumption. It felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd been told to ignore. Months turned into years without me noticing. My life grew slowly, deliberately. Better work, better pay, a sense of competence that didn't depend on anyone's approval. I stopped flinching when authority figures spoke. I learned how to listen without shrinking, how to ask questions without apologizing for them. Power, I realized, didn't announce itself. It accumulated quietly. I never called home. It wasn't out of spite. It was because every time I imagined picking up the phone, I felt the old weight pressing in, the expectation that I would explain myself in a way that made everyone else comfortable. I wasn't ready to give that up. Distance had given me perspective, and perspective had given me something close to peace. The moment I realized I was no longer trapped came unexpectedly. A small victory on paper, nothing dramatic. A decision I made that affected more than just my own corner of the world. Someone deferred to my judgment without hesitation, without checking with anyone else first. The ease of it startled me. I walked home that evening feeling lighter than I had in years, aware that fear no longer dictated my movements. It was around that time that I stumbled across something that made me stop. I was reviewing a set of public records for work routine research that required nothing more than attention to detail. My eyes skimmed lines of text automatically until they snagged on a familiar name. My name, not as a reference, not as an error, as a listed party in a document I had never seen before. I assumed it was a mistake. Names repeated, coincidences happened, but the more I looked, the more certain I became that this wasn't coincidence. The dates aligned too neatly. The associations were too specific. There it was again in another record, then another threaded through decisions made during the years I had been gone. A strange calm settled over me as I followed the trail. This wasn't panic, it was recognition. The same instinct that had once told me something didn't add up now hummed with certainty. My absence hadn't just been noticed, it had been used. I closed my laptop and sat back staring at the ceiling. For a long time, I had believed leaving meant forfeiting whatever claim I had to that family's world, that by walking away, I had removed myself from the story entirely. What I was beginning to understand was that stories continued whether you were present or not, and sometimes your silence was written in as consent. I thought back to the way my stepfather had always spoken about responsibility, about doing what was necessary for the greater good. How decisions were framed as burdens he carried for everyone else. How questioning those decisions had been treated as disloyalty. The pattern was suddenly obvious in a way it hadn't been before. They had never needed my approval. They had only needed my absence. The realization didn't make me angry right away. It made me focused. This was no longer about hurt feelings or unresolved family drama. This was about something concrete, something that could be traced and understood. The past had given me the instincts. The present had given me the tools. I began to gather information quietly, methodically, the way I'd learned to do everything else. I didn't reach out to anyone connected to my family. I didn't ask questions that would tip my hand. I let the records speak for themselves. Each piece confirmed what I already suspected. Decisions made on my behalf without my knowledge. Roles assigned to me without my consent. Structures built that relied on my name while assuming my silence, and still they hadn't called. Not until recently. Not until something shifted enough to make my absence a problem instead of a convenience. I sat there connecting the dots and felt something close to gratitude. If they had reached out earlier, if they had tried to pull me back before I understood what I was capable of, things might have ended differently. But they hadn't. They had underestimated me, written me off as the weak link who would either return apologetically or disappear entirely. They were wrong on both counts. I closed the laptop and stood walking to the window. The city lights blinked on as dusk settled steady and indifferent. Somewhere my stepfather was going about his life believing he still understood the rules of the game, believing he still controlled the board. I smiled to myself, not with satisfaction, but with resolve. They thought silence meant I was gone. What they never realized was that silence was where I learned how to listen. He called again 3 days later. This time the number wasn't blocked. He wanted me to see it. He wanted me to hesitate before answering, to feel the old reflex kick in, the one that said, authority deserved acknowledgement. I let it ring until the last second, long enough to remind him that time no longer moved on his schedule. I was beginning to think you'd lost your manners, he said when I finally picked up. His voice was smoother now, measured, wrapped in the tone he used when he believed he was being reasonable. We need to resolve this. Resolve. The word landed like a demand disguised as compromise. What exactly is this? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Professional. The way I spoke to people who assumed they were in control without realizing the ground beneath them was already unstable. There was a pause, a small one but telling. He hadn't expected a question. He never did. Family matters, he said. Things that should have been handled years ago if you hadn't disappeared. There it was, the rewrite. My leaving framed as abandonment, my absence recast as irresponsibility. He spoke as if the years between us were a tantrum I'd stretched out too long, not a boundary I'd built to survive. I didn't disappear, I said. I left. Another pause, shorter this time, irritation leaking through the polish. However you want to phrase it, he replied. The point is, your name is involved in some decisions that can't move forward without you. Your continued silence is inconvenient. Inconvenient, not hurtful, not concerning, inconvenient. I leaned back in my chair and let him keep talking. People like him revealed more when you didn't interrupt. He spoke about timelines, about the end of the year, about how things needed to be finalized before the holidays. He used words like routine and straightforward as if repetition could strip them of meaning. There are documents, he said, signatures, formalities. And why would you need me for that now? I asked. You're listed, he said quickly, too quickly, as a beneficiary, as a stakeholder. Stakeholder. The word caught my attention. He had never used it in relation to me before. Growing up, my role had been emotional at best, symbolic, something to manage, not involve. What kind of documents I pressed? He sighed, the sound carefully calibrated to suggest patience. Legal ones, financial ones. I don't want to get into details over the phone. This is something we should discuss in person. As a family. The word family hung between us heavy and hollow. Then he changed tactics. Your mother hasn't been well, he said. His voice softened, dropping into concern so practiced it might have fooled someone who hadn't grown up listening to it. The stress of all this hasn't helped. She's been asking about you. My jaw tightened. There it was, the lever. He had always known exactly which buttons to push, and he pressed this one gently as if doing me a favor. I spoke to her last month, I said. She didn't mention being unwell. Well, she wouldn't, he replied. She doesn't like to worry people, especially you. I pictured my mother the way I'd last seen her, composed and careful, choosing calm over confrontation every time. The idea that she was suddenly fragile enough to require my immediate return felt staged. Still, the old ache stirred the instinct to protect that had never quite gone away. I ignored it. If this is so urgent, I said, you can explain it now. He exhaled sharply, the mask slipping just a fraction. I'm trying to handle this properly, involving lawyers' advisors. The more questions you ask, the more complicated it becomes. That told me everything I needed to know. Complication was his enemy. Transparency even more so. I'm not agreeing to anything I don't understand, I said, and I'm not traveling across the country on a vague warning. Silence stretched between us, thick and charged. When he spoke again, the warmth was gone. You don't have the full picture, he said, and you're not in a position to demand it. There it was, the edge, the reminder of how he believed power worked. Actually, I said quietly, if my name is involved, I am. He didn't respond right away. I imagined him recalibrating, deciding how far he could push without losing ground. When he spoke, his voice had lowered, the words measured but sharp. "You're putting everyone at risk by dragging this out," he said. "There are consequences to delaying, financial ones, legal ones, things that could affect your mother's security." He never said threat. He didn't need to. The implication did the work for him. I felt a flicker of anger, then hot and familiar. Not fear, not anymore. Anger at the audacity of using the same tools after all this time, as if I hadn't learned how to see them for what they were. "Are you saying something is wrong?" I asked. "Or are you just trying to scare me into cooperation?" "You're being dramatic," he snapped. "This isn't about you. It's about cleaning up loose ends." Loose ends. I thought about the records I'd seen, the way my name had appeared where it shouldn't, the timing of decisions made while I was unreachable. Loose ends indeed. "I'll think about it," I said. "You don't have time to think," he replied immediately. "We need an answer." "You'll have one," I said, and ended the call before he could stop me. I sat there for a long moment, phone resting in my hand, heart steady. 5 years ago, a conversation like that would have sent me spiraling, questioning my memory, my judgment, my right to say no. Now it felt like a negotiation I hadn't agreed to enter. I called the one person who knew enough about my work to understand why my voice sounded the way it did. "He's panicking," she said after I explained the call. "People like that only reach out when something's already wrong." That's what I thought. "Did he say what he needs?" "Not directly," I said. "Just signatures, presence, validation." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing." "No," I agreed. "It's not." We talked through possibilities, scenarios neither of us named out loud. If my name was tied to something improperly, my involvement could legitimize it after the fact. If there were deadlines missing, them might expose whatever he'd been hiding. The urgency wasn't about me coming home. It was about him running out of options. When we hung up, I felt the last of my doubt dissolve. He hadn't called because he wanted reconciliation. He hadn't called because he felt guilty. He had called because my absence had shifted from useful to dangerous. That night, I didn't sleep much, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. My mind traced the outlines of what I'd already seen, connecting it to the pressure in his voice, the sudden inclusion of my mother, the insistence on speed. The picture forming wasn't complete, but it was clear enough to guide my next move. I would not refuse him outright. Refusal would provoke him. It would push him to act without me, to close ranks, to hide whatever he still could. Agreement, on the other hand, would make him careless. It would make him believe the old dynamic still worked, so I would give him just enough. The next morning I sent a brief message, neutral, polite. I said I needed to review the documents before committing to travel. I said I wanted specifics, dates, locations, names of advisors involved. His reply came almost immediately. Too immediate. A list followed longer than I'd expected, filled with details he'd previously claimed were unnecessary. The speed of it confirmed my suspicion. He wasn't in control. He was reacting. I closed my phone and let out a slow breath. For years he had believed my silence meant he had won, that by walking away I had removed myself from the equation entirely. What he was only beginning to understand was that silence didn't erase you. Sometimes it made you the most dangerous variable of all. He thought this was about getting me back under his roof. It wasn't. It was about why he suddenly couldn't move forward without me, and what would happen once I understood exactly how much he needed me to stay quiet. I didn't argue with him. I didn't accuse him. I didn't even tell him no. I did something far more useful. I started looking. The moment I decided to stall something inside me shifted from reaction to intention. Fear burned out and left behind a clean, focused curiosity. Whatever he needed from me, whatever he was trying to rush me into, it wasn't personal, it was structural, and structures always left traces. I didn't call anyone in my family. I didn't ask questions that could circle back to him. I went where answers didn't have opinions. Public records, archived filings, databases no one checked unless they had a reason. I treated it like work because that's what it was now. A problem to be understood, not a wound to be reopened. At first nothing jumped out. Pages of dry language, names I didn't recognize, entities formed and dissolved over time. It was easy to see how someone without patience would give up and accept whatever explanation they were offered. That was how people like him survived. They relied on exhaustion. Then I saw it. My name. Not buried in a footnote. Not listed as a witness. It appeared cleanly formally, as if it had every right to be there. Attached to a structure I had never agreed to, tied to decisions I had never signed off on. My stomach tightened, not with panic, but with recognition. This wasn't a mistake. I checked again, cross-referenced, different source, same result. There it was again, threaded through documents dated during the years I had been gone. My silence had been recorded as consent, my absence interpreted as availability. I followed the trail, carefully building a timeline that showed how things moved while I was unreachable, changes made around holidays, filings submitted when response windows were shortest, everything designed to slide through unnoticed. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. He hadn't stolen money. Not directly. He had stolen something more useful. He had stolen my name. I thought back to all the times he had spoken about responsibility, about how someone had to make hard decisions for the good of the family, how he framed control as protection. The language in the documents echoed that same philosophy. Authority justified by necessity, oversight framed as burden. The realization settled slowly like sediment. My role wasn't incidental. It was essential. I brought everything to the one person I trusted to see it clearly. She didn't interrupt while I walked her through what I'd found. She didn't soften her response when I finished. "This isn't accidental," she said. "They positioned you." "For what?" "To legitimize something that doesn't hold up on its own," she replied. "Without you, it's exposed. With you, it looks inherited, authorized, clean, clean." The word made my jaw clench. "So that's why he needs me to show up," I said. "Not just sign." "Presence matters," she said. "Being there makes it harder to argue you were excluded." I pictured him across a table, confident again, walking me through a narrative he'd rehearsed until it sounded reasonable even to himself. I imagined my mother sitting quietly beside him, nodding along, grateful someone else was handling it. The anger came then, sharp and clear. Not the kind that made you reckless, the kind that made you precise. "How bad is it?" I asked. She hesitated. "Bad enough that he's panicking. Bad enough that time matters." I nodded slowly. That matched everything else. The urgency, the refusal to explain over the phone, the sudden concern for my mother's health. It was all pressure layered and deliberate. As we dug deeper, another pattern emerged, one I hadn't expected but recognized instantly once I saw it. There were names that appeared repeatedly in the margins. Assistants, administrators, long-term staff members whose roles never changed, even as structures around them shifted. People who had been present long enough to see everything. One name in particular surfaced again and again, attached to routine filings and approvals that stretched back years. A quiet constant. Someone who had been there before I left. Someone who had stayed. I didn't reach out. Not yet. I filed it away. The more I learned, the clearer it became why he had waited so long to contact me. As long as my silence benefited him, it was ignored. As long as my absence allowed him to move unchecked, it was framed as independence. But now something had tipped. The system he'd built required my cooperation to keep standing, and cooperation once requested could be withheld. I spent the next 2 days assembling everything into a single narrative. Not the one he wanted me to believe, but the one the facts told without emotion. It was meticulous work. I moved slowly, deliberately aware that rushing now would only serve him. Every document, every date, every connection added weight to a truth he had assumed I would never uncover. By the time I finished, the picture was undeniable. They hadn't just acted without me. They had planned around me, counted on my distance, relied on my reluctance to return. I thought about the girl who had left in the dark with a suitcase and a promise she barely understood. I thought about how carefully he had cultivated the belief that leaving meant forfeiting everything, how convenient that belief had been. My phone buzzed while I was staring at the screen, the light reflecting off my glasses. Another message from him. Shorter this time. Less polite. "We need to finalize this. Stop delaying." I didn't respond. Instead, I stood and walked to the window, watching the city move without me. People hurrying to places that mattered to them. Decisions being made without drama. Consequences unfolding quietly, relentlessly. For the first time, I considered returning. Not because he demanded it, not because my mother needed reassurance, but because there were things you couldn't see clearly from a distance. There were conversations that revealed more when held face to face. Desperation had a way of leaking through body language, through impatience, through the cracks in rehearsed stories. If I went back, it wouldn't be to comply. It would be to observe. I sat down again and opened a new document, this one blank. At the top, I typed a single line. Conditions. I listed what I would require before I agreed to anything. Full access, full disclosure, no surprises. I knew he wouldn't like it. I knew he would push back. That was fine. Every objection would tell me more. Before closing the laptop, I glanced once more at the name that kept appearing in the records. The quiet constant. The person who had seen the structure evolve, who had likely noticed the same inconsistencies I had. Someone who might already know how this ended. I smiled faintly. He thought I was coming back to sign something. What he didn't understand was that by calling me, he had done the one thing he should have avoided. He had reminded me that my name carried weight, and I was finally ready to decide how to use it. I agreed to come back 2 days later, and the moment I did, I felt the balance shift. Not outwardly, not in any way he could hear through the phone. But inside, something settled into place, with a calm I didn't expect. This wasn't surrender. It wasn't reconciliation. It was reconnaissance. I told myself that clearly the way you repeat instructions before entering unfamiliar territory. I didn't tell him yes right away. I asked questions first. Dates, locations, who would be present, what documents needed to be reviewed. I kept my tone neutral, professional, as if this were a business trip instead of a return to the place I'd escaped in the dark. He answered quickly, too quickly, grateful for any sign of cooperation. His eagerness leaked through every clipped reply. "You don't need to overthink this," he said. "It's all very straightforward." Straightforward was never a word he used, unless something was anything but. Before I booked anything, I called the one person who had helped me piece together what was really happening. We went over everything again, slower this time. Stress testing assumptions, identifying pressure points. She reminded me of the rules I'd already written for myself. Don't react emotionally. Don't reveal what you know. Let them talk. Desperation makes people careless. Remember, she said before we hung up, they believe you're coming back confused, hurt, grateful for guidance. Let them keep believing that. I packed differently this time. No rushing, no panic. I chose clothes that made me feel grounded, not invisible. I brought documents, notes, copies of records I hoped I wouldn't need, but wanted close anyway. I left behind anything that tied me to the version of myself they expected to see. This wasn't a return. It was an inspection. The journey itself felt surreal. The last time I'd taken this route, every mile, had been fueled by fear and adrenaline. Now I noticed things I hadn't before. The way the landscape changed gradually instead of all at once. The way my body stayed relaxed instead of braced. Distance had rewired me. The place I was going back to no longer felt larger than I was. When I arrived, the house looked exactly as it always had. Polished, controlled, aggressively welcoming. Seasonal decorations framed the entrance, every detail curated to suggest warmth and tradition. It felt like walking into a memory someone else had edited. My mother was the first to see me. She rushed forward with a brightness that didn't quite land, wrapping me in a hug that lingered too long. Her voice trembled as she told me how good it was to see me, how worried she'd been, how relieved she was that I'd come. I held her gently and stepped back. Behind her, he waited. He stood the way he always did, centered hands relaxed at his sides, expression composed. He looked older, though I couldn't have said exactly how. Less solid somehow. The confidence was still there, but it felt practiced now, something he put on deliberately. "Welcome back," he said, as if I were a guest arriving late to dinner instead of the person he'd spent years pretending didn't exist. "Thank you," I replied. The words tasted strange in my mouth, but they served their purpose. Politeness kept doors open. The first few hours passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Small talk, carefully chosen anecdotes. My mother hovered, filling silences before they could stretch into something dangerous. He watched me closely, measuring reactions, looking for cracks. I gave him none. What struck me most was the urgency humming beneath everything. Meals were rushed, conversations steered. Any attempt to linger on irrelevant topics was gently but firmly redirected. He wanted to get to business, and he wanted to do it before I had time to settle. That alone told me how little margin he thought he had left. I was shown to my old room, preserved like a museum exhibit. The same neutral bedding, the same furniture positioned just so. It was meant to make me feel small, to trigger familiarity, nostalgia. Instead, it felt staged, a reminder of how little they'd known me even then. That night alone in that room, I didn't sleep much, not because I was anxious, but because I was alert. I listened to the house, to the way sound traveled through familiar hallways. I noticed how often my mother's door opened and closed, how voices dropped when I passed certain rooms. Secrets made noise if you paid attention. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning. He didn't call it a meeting, of course. He framed it as a conversation, a chance to clear the air. But the documents were already laid out when I walked into the room, stacked neatly, tabs marking important sections. He stood beside them like a host presenting a gift. I thought it would be best to address everything quickly, he said. No sense dragging things out. My mother sat nearby, hands folded, eyes moving between us. She looked tired. Not fragile, not ill, just worn down by the effort of holding things together without ever asking what they were being held together for. I took my seat without comment. He began talking immediately, his voice calm, confident, guiding us through a story I recognized from my research. He spoke about responsibility, about decisions made in my absence, about the necessity of acting decisively when family members couldn't be reached. He used my silence like a justification, my distance like permission. I didn't interrupt. I let him explain things I already understood. I let him gloss over gaps I knew were intentional. Each omission confirmed the map I'd drawn in my head. My mother nodded along occasionally, adding a comment about how difficult those years had been, how grateful she was that someone had stepped up. Stepped up. I watched him carefully as he spoke. The slight tightening of his jaw when I looked too closely at a page, the way his hand hovered over certain sections of the documents, guiding attention away from others. He was controlling the narrative the way he always had, confident in his ability to keep everyone oriented where he wanted them. What he didn't realize was that I was no longer the audience. I was the auditor. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly, waiting for gratitude, for relief, for compliance. I gave him something else. I'd like to review these in detail, I said evenly. On my own. The room shifted. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, he said. But there isn't really anything here that requires extensive review. It's all quite standard. I'm sure, I replied. Still, I won't be signing anything today. My mother inhaled sharply. He stiffened. There's no reason to delay, he said, the edge creeping back into his voice. We've already gone over everything. And I've listened, I said. Now I need to verify. Silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken tension. For the first time since I'd arrived, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. Just a flash, just enough. That night back in my room, I replayed every moment of the day, cataloging reactions, inconsistencies, tells. The picture that formed was clearer than ever. They believed my return meant resolution. They believed I'd come back to be folded neatly into the structure they'd built without me. They hadn't considered the possibility that I'd come back to examine it. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about the conditions I'd set before agreeing to this trip. Full access, full disclosure, no surprises. He had already failed the first test. Tomorrow, I would start asking real questions, not accusations, not emotional appeals. Questions that required answers he couldn't improvise. He thought my return meant surrender. What he didn't understand was that I hadn't come back to belong. I had come back to see exactly where the lie began. The first real crack appeared just after breakfast. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no confrontation, just a pause that lasted half a second too long when I asked a simple question. Who prepared these summaries, I said, tapping the thin folder he'd slid toward me, the one labeled Overview as if that word could replace detail. He didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the page, then to my mother, then back to me. Our advisors, he said, the same firm we've always used. Always was another one of his favorite words. It suggested continuity, stability, a long, unbroken line of good decisions. It also collapsed under scrutiny if you pulled on it hard enough. Which advisor, I asked. This time the pause was longer. He named someone I didn't recognize. I nodded as if that meant something to me. I made a note. I asked another question, then another. Dates, authorization chains, why certain filings happened when they did, why others were delayed. Each question was reasonable on its own. Together they formed pressure. My mother shifted in her seat, her discomfort visible now. She wasn't used to this version of me. She kept looking at him as if waiting for him to take over, to smooth things out the way he always had. He tried. You have to understand, he said, leaning back, adopting a patient tone. When you left, decisions still had to be made. We couldn't just freeze everything. I'm not suggesting you should have, I replied calmly. I'm asking why those decisions required my name. There it was again. The silence. He recovered quickly, but not cleanly, because it was the most efficient structure available at the time. Efficient. Another favorite. Another deflection. I let the conversation move on, but I didn't forget the moment. People like him slipped when they felt rushed, when they assumed the other person wouldn't notice the gap between explanation and truth. Later that afternoon, I excused myself under the pretense of needing some air. The house felt tighter with every hour, the walls pressing in as if they were complicit. I walked the perimeter, letting the cold clear my head. That's when I saw her. She was standing near the side entrance, sorting through deliveries, her movements steady and unhurried. She'd been here longer than anyone else. Longer than him, longer than the version of my family he'd constructed. She looked up when she noticed me, surprise flickering across her face, before settling into something warmer. I wondered when you'd come back, she said quietly. I smiled, a real one this time. I wasn't sure I ever would. We stood there for a moment, the space between us filled with years of things never said. She didn't ask why I'd left. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply waited. I have a question, I said finally, and I need an honest answer. She nodded once. I don't have much else to give. Do you remember when my name started appearing on documents, I asked? Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. Yes, she said. I remember. Was I ever asked no? The word landed softly and heavily at the same time. Did anyone object, I asked. She hesitated, then met my gaze directly. People noticed, she said carefully. Not everyone felt it was their place to say anything. But you did, I said. She smiled faintly. I learned a long time ago that silence protects the wrong people. She told me things I'd suspected but hadn't been able to prove. About meetings held behind closed doors. About instructions that changed depending on who was listening. About how my absence had been used as a convenience, a way to move faster without explanation. They assumed you wouldn't come back, she said. Or that if you did, you'd be too grateful to question anything. Grateful. The word made my stomach turn. Why didn't you say something sooner, I asked. Her gaze drifted toward the house. Because saying something without proof only gets you removed, and I wanted to stay close. Stay close. To watch. To remember. Did you keep anything, I asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pressed something small into my hand. A flash drive. Unmarked. I didn't know if you'd ever need it, she said, but I kept it anyway. I closed my fingers around it, heart steady, mind racing. Thank you, I said. She nodded. Be careful, she added. He doesn't like losing control. That night, alone in my room, I plugged the drive into my laptop. What I found wasn't explosive on its own. No dramatic confessions, no obvious crimes laid bare. What it contained was something far more dangerous to him. Context, patterns, records of conversations, drafts of documents, internal notes that showed how decisions were framed internally versus how they were presented to outsiders. It was enough to confirm that this wasn't mismanagement. It was design. I slept lightly, my mind assembling pieces into a shape that finally made sense. When morning came, I felt different. Not anxious, not angry, prepared. Breakfast was tense. He kept glancing at his watch, impatience breaking through his composure. He wanted closure. He wanted signatures. He wanted me back in the role he'd assigned. "I'd like to go through the original files today," I said casually, buttering my toast. "Not the summaries." He froze. "That won't be necessary," he said too quickly. "Everything relevant is already—" "I disagree," I said, still calm. "If my name is attached, I need to see the source material." My mother looked between us, confusion giving way to unease. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "There doesn't have to be," I said gently, "as long as there's transparency." He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. "You're turning this into something it doesn't need to be, and you're trying to rush me," I replied, meeting his eyes, which makes me wonder why. For a moment, the mask slipped entirely. The anger was there, raw and familiar. The same expression I'd seen years ago, the one that had taught me exactly how conditional his control was. "You don't understand the consequences," he said, his voice low. "There are timelines, external pressures." "I understand perfectly," I said. "That's why I won't be signing anything yet." The room went silent. He stared at me, calculating, reassessing. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He smiled. "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need." It was too easy. Too quick. I returned the smile, already certain of what came next. When people like him stopped pushing, it wasn't because they'd given up. It was because they were changing tactics. As I left the room, I felt it in my bones. The shift, the escalation. He believed he could still outmaneuver me, still frame the story in his favor. What he didn't know was that the story was no longer his to tell, and I was done pretending I didn't see the trap closing around him. He tried to corner me that afternoon, but not with paperwork. It was subtler than that, more personal, more dangerous. I was in the den reviewing copies of financial statements when he appeared in the doorway without knocking, leaning casually against the frame like this was his house, and I was a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. He didn't speak right away. He just watched me the way someone watches an animal they're deciding how to handle. "You've changed," he said finally. I didn't look up. People tend to. "Not always for the better," he replied. There it was, the first direct jab. He was testing whether shame still worked. "I'm not here to be evaluated," I said, flipping a page. "If you have something relevant, say it." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. The sound clicked too loudly in the quiet. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, dragging things out, asking questions that don't lead anywhere useful. "They lead somewhere useful for me," I replied. "That's the problem," he snapped, then caught himself. His voice smoothed again, false calm, settling back in. "You think this is about you." "It is about me," I said evenly. "My name, my liability, my consent." He laughed softly, the sound humorless. "You really believe you're the center of all this. I believe I'm the piece you can't replace," I said, meeting his eyes for the first time. The effect was immediate. His jaw tightened, his gaze hardened. For a split second, I saw the truth break through before he masked it again. "You're overestimating your leverage," he said. "Am I?" I asked. "Then why are you so eager for me to sign?" Silence fell between us, thick and loaded. He turned away first. "You don't understand the risks," he said. "The kind of attention this draws if it doesn't get resolved." "Attention from whom?" I asked. He hesitated. "Just long enough." "From people who don't care about family disputes," he said. "From institutions that move slowly and crush everything underneath them." It was a familiar tactic. Vague threats framed as concern. External enemies invoked to justify internal control. "You mean investigators?" I said. He stiffened. "I mean consequences," he replied. I closed the folder and stood. If there's an investigation, transparency is the safest option. "You don't get to decide that," he said sharply, "and you don't get to decide for me anymore." The words landed harder than I expected, not because they surprised him, but because they surprised me. Saying them out loud sealed something. A door I hadn't realized was still ajar closed firmly behind me. He stared at me, his expression shifting again, recalculating. When he spoke, his voice dropped quieter now. "You think you're protected," he said. "That walking away made you untouchable." "It didn't. I don't need to be untouchable," I replied. "I just need to be informed." He stepped closer, invading my space deliberately. The move was instinctive for him, a reminder of old hierarchies. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said. "No," I said softly. "You are." Something flickered across his face then. Fear. Real fear. It vanished quickly, replaced by anger, but it was there long enough for me to recognize it. He turned abruptly and left the room without another word. I stood there for a moment, heart steady, listening to his footsteps retreat. 5 years ago, an encounter like that would have left me shaking. Now it felt like confirmation. That evening, my mother asked if we could talk. She found me in the kitchen, her voice tentative, her hands twisting together in a way I remembered from childhood. It was the posture she took when she wanted peace more than truth. "He says you're upset," she said gently, "that you think something's wrong." "I think something is hidden," I replied. She sighed. "He's trying to protect us," from what I asked. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted to the doorway as if making sure we were alone. "From collapse," she said finally. "From losing everything we've built. We didn't build it," I said quietly. "He did. Without me." "You left," she said, a hint of accusation slipping through. "You weren't here." "I left because I wasn't safe," I said, "and because no one protected me." Her face tightened. "That's not fair." "It's accurate," I replied. She looked away, blinking rapidly. "You don't understand how complicated things were. I understand more than you think I said. Enough to know that asking me to sign something without explanation isn't protection. It's sacrifice." She flinched at that. "You'd really let this fall apart?" she asked. "After everything?" "Everything includes me," I said. "And I'm done being excluded when it's convenient and included when it's useful." She didn't argue. That was the answer. That night I sent a message to the person who had given me the flash drive. I didn't explain. I didn't ask questions. I just said I was ready. The response came quickly. "Tomorrow morning. Early." I didn't sleep much. Not from fear, but from anticipation. The house felt different now. Tighter. Charged. Like everyone was waiting for something to break. Morning came gray and cold. I left before anyone else was awake, slipping out quietly, coat pulled tight around me. The air outside was sharp, clearing my head with every breath. We met in a place he never went. Neutral. Unremarkable. A location chosen specifically because it didn't belong to him. She was already there, sitting calmly, hands folded, eyes alert. "It's moving faster than I expected," she said without preamble. "Because he's running out of time," I replied. She nodded. "He's been making calls, pressuring people, trying to close loops." "That means he's scared," I said. "Yes," she agreed. "And that makes him unpredictable." She slid a folder across the table. Thicker than the last, more complete. "This is everything I could safely copy," she said. "Some of it confirms what you already know. Some of it goes further." I opened it slowly, scanning pages, dates, annotations. The patterns were undeniable now. The narrative he'd been selling didn't just omit details, it reversed them. He positioned himself as the buffer, I said, the protector. "And you as the justification," she replied. I looked up. "If this comes out, it won't be clean," she said. "But it will be clear." I nodded. That was enough. When I returned to the house later that day, the atmosphere had shifted again. The politeness was gone. The smiles strained. He barely acknowledged me, but I could feel his attention tracking every movement. Dinner passed in tense silence. No one mentioned documents. No one mentioned timelines. It felt like the calm before something violent. As I excused myself for the night, he spoke from the end of the table. "We'll settle this tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. "Yes," I replied. "We will." In my room, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of the folder heavy in my bag. Tomorrow wouldn't be about questions anymore. Tomorrow he would realize that the leverage he thought he had over me had reversed completely. And once that realization hit, he wouldn't stay polite. he would escalate, which meant I needed to be ready for exactly who he became when control stopped working. The confrontation didn't start with shouting. It started with coffee. He was already seated at the table when I came down the next morning, jacket on papers spread in front of him like a chessboard mid-game. My mother stood at the counter pretending to busy herself with mugs she'd already cleaned. No one smiled. No one said good morning. "Sit," he said, not looking up. I took the chair across from him and placed my bag at my feet. I didn't open it. I didn't need to yet. "We're out of time," he said. "This needs to be finalized today." "Then today is a bad day to rush," I replied. He slid a document toward me, tapping the signature line with his finger. "You've reviewed enough. This is the final version." I didn't touch it. I reviewed summaries. I asked for originals. "You don't need originals," he snapped. "You need to sign." There it was, the command stripped bare. "I'm not signing anything that retroactively authorizes actions taken without my consent," I said calmly. "Especially not actions that expose me to liability." His head snapped up. "Liability?" "Yes," I said. "That word you've been avoiding." He leaned back, studying me, as if seeing me for the first time. "You think you're in danger?" "I think you put me there," I replied. My mother turned her voice sharp with panic. "What are you talking about?" I looked at her then. Really looked. My name appears on entities I didn't create, decisions I didn't approve, structures I didn't benefit from. If anything collapses, I'm not a bystander. I'm attached. "That's absurd," he said quickly. "You're family." "That's not a legal category," I said. He stood pacing now, the control slipping. "You're twisting this. Everything I did was to keep things stable, to protect this family." "By using me as insulation," I said. "Without telling me." He stopped moving. His face hardened. "You walked away. You forfeited your right to complain." "I forfeited proximity," I said, "not my identity." The silence that followed was brittle. My mother sank into a chair, hands trembling. "You're exaggerating," she whispered. "He wouldn't do that." I reached into my bag then and pulled out a folder. "Not everything, just enough." "These are internal drafts," I said, laying them out. "Early versions, notes in the margins. They show intent." He lunged forward, grabbing for them. I pulled them back. "Don't I said? That would be unwise." His breathing quickened. "Where did you get those?" "From someone who noticed when my name started appearing where it didn't belong," I said. "Someone who kept copies." My mother looked between us, confusion giving way to dawning horror. "Is this true?" He didn't answer her. He stared at me. "You think this gives you leverage?" he said. "It doesn't. It gives me clarity," I replied. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he said, his voice dropping. "There are people watching. Deadlines, consequences. Investigators," I asked. He slammed his hand on the table. "Stop saying that." The sound echoed through the room. My mother flinched. "You want the truth," he snapped. "Fine. If this doesn't close, it all unravels. Deals fall apart. Reviews get triggered. And when that happens, everyone loses." "Everyone or you?" I asked. He turned on me, eyes blazing. "You think you're better than this? You think walking away made you clean? Your name is already in it. Signing protects you." "No," I said. "Signing binds me." He laughed sharp and humorless. "You don't have a choice." I stood. "That's where you're wrong." He moved toward me too fast, too close. My body reacted before my mind did, stepping back, putting space between us. "You always did this," he hissed. "Push, question, undermine. And you always responded with force," I said quietly. My mother gasped. "What does that mean?" He froze. I let the silence stretch every second, a wait. "5 years ago," I said, my voice steady. "You taught me exactly what your authority looked like when challenged." His jaw clenched. "You're still clinging to that." "I'm anchoring to it," I replied, "because it explains everything that came after." "You're lying," he said, "but there was no conviction in it." "I'm done protecting you from the consequences of your own behavior," I said. "I won't sign, I won't validate, and I won't stay quiet." My mother stood abruptly, chair scraping. "Enough," she said, tears streaming now. "Both of you, this is tearing us apart." "It was torn long before today," I said gently. "This is just when you're seeing it." He rounded on her, then anger spilling over. You see what she's doing? She's threatening everything." I met his gaze. "No, I'm refusing to be used to save you." The room felt smaller, charged, dangerous. He looked at me like he was weighing something irreversible. "You think you can walk out and blow this up," he said. "You think anyone will believe you?" "I don't need belief," I said. "I need documentation." His eyes flicked to the folder in my hand. "Give me those," he said. "No." He stepped forward again, hand lifting, and stopped. Not because he chose to, because my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't look away as I pulled it out. "Excuse me," I said, answering it. I listened for a moment, then nodded once. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. "What was that?" he demanded. I met his eyes. "That I said was the last opportunity you had to keep this private." The color drained from his face. My mother looked between us, breath hitching. "What did you do?" "I stopped protecting the wrong person," I said. He laughed then, a wild, brittle sound. "You think you've won. I think you're about to understand what it feels like," I replied, "when control stops working." I walked past him and out of the room, leaving the documents on the table, the air thick with everything unsaid. Behind me something shattered. I didn't turn around, because whatever came next, I had already chosen my side, and he was finally realizing that the version of me he built his strategy around no longer existed. The knock came just after midnight. Not loud, not urgent. The kind of knock meant to avoid witnesses, meant to suggest reason instead of force. I was awake already, sitting on the edge of the bed, shoes on coat folded neatly beside me. I'd learned long ago that the most dangerous moments arrived quietly. I didn't open the door. "Open it," he said through the wood. His voice was low, controlled, pressed flat by restraint. "We need to talk." "We already did," I replied. "This is different." "It always is," I said. Silence followed, then a sigh exaggerated like he was tired of playing games. "You don't understand what you've started," he said. "Once this moves forward, it doesn't stop." I stood and opened the door just enough to face him, keeping my body angled, one foot braced against the frame. He was closer than I expected. Too close. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitch. "You should go back to bed," I said. "We'll speak in the morning." "There may not be a morning," he said. "Not the kind you're expecting." There it was. Not a threat, a suggestion. I stepped fully into the hallway, closing the door behind me. "Say what you came to say." He stared at me, really stared this time, as if searching for the version of me he'd built his plans around. When he didn't find her, frustration flickered. "You think exposing this will make you whole," he said. "It won't. It will burn everything, your mother included." "My mother made her choices," I replied. "So did you." "You're condemning her," he said sharply. "She doesn't survive this. She survives truth," I said. "What she won't survive is more lies." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You're naive. Systems don't care about morality. They care about closure." "I'm not seeking closure," I said. "I'm seeking accuracy." His face darkened. "Accuracy doesn't protect people. Control doesn't either," I said. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The house was silent around us, as if holding its breath. Then his tone shifted, turning almost reasonable. "If you walk this back," he said, "if you tell them you misunderstood, that you were emotional, I can still fix this. Fix it for whom I asked. For everyone," he said. "You included." I shook my head. "That's not fixing. That's erasing." His patience snapped. "You think you're immune now," he hissed. "You think aligning yourself with outside forces makes you safe? You're disposable." I met his gaze steady. "Then why are you standing here at midnight asking me to save you?" The words landed like a blow. He recoiled slightly, then straightened, anger surging. "You ungrateful, leave," I said. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've always needed someone to protect you." I didn't step back. "No. I needed someone to stop you." His hand twitched at his side. Just once. A familiar movement, instinctive, unconscious. I smiled, slow and cold. "That won't work anymore," I said. "And we both know it." Something broke behind his eyes then. Not rage. Fear. "You've already contacted them," he said. "Yes," I replied. "How long?" he demanded. "Long enough," I said. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned abruptly and walked away, his footsteps sharp against the floor. I watched until he disappeared down the hall, then returned to my room and locked the door. I slept. Not deeply, not peacefully, but enough. Morning arrived, gray and heavy, the air thick with tension. I was packing when the sound of raised voices drifted upstairs. My mother crying. His voice sharp-cutting. I didn't intervene. This wasn't my fight anymore. When I came down, the house felt altered, exposed. Papers were scattered across the dining table drawers, pulled open order, unraveling into chaos. He stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear, pacing. My mother sat rigid on the couch, eyes red, hands clenched in her lap. "They're coming," he said into the phone. "I don't care what it takes. Delay it." He saw me then and froze. "They're on their way," he said flatly. "You've done this. I documented it," I replied. "You did the rest. You'll regret this," he said. "I already survived it," I said. The doorbell rang. Once, twice. My mother flinched. He didn't move. I walked past them and opened the door. They didn't look dramatic. No flashing lights. No raised voices. Just calm authority badges, presented, names exchanged. The kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself loudly to be effective. "May we come in?" one of them asked. "Yes," I said. He lunged forward, then too late. "You don't have a warrant." "We do," the other replied, holding it up. "And a lot of questions." The house filled with movement. Quiet, efficient. They separated us, asked us to sit. They didn't rush. They didn't accuse. They let the silence do the work. He tried once more, leaning forward, voice controlled. "This is a misunderstanding." The agent looked at him calmly. "We'll determine that." They asked me questions first. Simple ones. Names, dates, confirmation of facts already known. I answered without embellishment, without emotion. The truth didn't need performance. When they turned to him, his composure cracked. He spoke too fast, over-explained, contradicted himself. His earlier confidence collapsed under scrutiny. The narrative he'd relied on unraveled when confronted with documents he hadn't anticipated. At one point, he looked at me, eyes blazing. "You planned this." "I prepared for it," I said. "There's a difference." My mother watched everything in stunned silence, her understanding catching up too late. When they asked her what she knew, she faltered, unsure which version of the story to tell. The truth has a way of cornering people like that. By the time they escorted him out, the house felt hollow, like a set after the actors had left. My mother slumped into herself, the weight of it all pressing down at once. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "I tried," I said. "You didn't want to hear it?" She nodded slowly, tears falling. "I thought keeping the peace meant keeping us safe. It meant keeping him comfortable," I said gently. She didn't argue. When they were gone, I finished packing. There was nothing left for me here. No closure to chase, no reconciliation to force. At the door, I paused. "This isn't revenge," I said quietly. "It's accountability." She looked up at me, something like recognition flickering through the exhaustion. "I know," she said. I left without looking back. Outside, the air felt lighter, colder, cleaner. For the first time since he'd called me years ago, I felt the weight lift completely. Whatever happened next would unfold without my silence propping it up. He had built his control on the assumption that I would disappear when things got ugly. He was wrong. And now the truth was doing what I never could. It was standing its ground. The house didn't look smaller when I left it for the last time. It just looked quieter. The driveway was empty, the windows dark, the decorations still hung up as if nothing had happened. From the outside, it could have passed for any other place where a family once gathered and told itself comforting stories. That illusion no longer belonged to me. I drove away before sunrise, not because I was afraid to be seen, but because I wanted the moment to be mine alone. No witnesses, no explanations. Just distance building mile by mile between me and a version of my life that had ended the moment he raised his hand and thought he could rewrite what followed. For the first few hours, I didn't turn on the radio. I let the silence settle. It felt earned. People assume the end of something like that comes with triumph, with satisfaction, with a rush of relief so intense it makes everything before it worth enduring. The truth is quieter. It's a steadiness you didn't have before, a sense that the ground under your feet will hold even if you don't know where you're going yet. The investigation moved forward without me. That was important. I didn't need to narrate it, defend it, or manage anyone's emotions around it. I had given what I needed to give. The rest belonged to processes bigger than one man's ability to intimidate. My mother called once weeks later. Her voice sounded older, not weaker, just stripped of its careful softness. I should have listened, she said. I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't scold her either. Accountability didn't mean cruelty, but it also didn't mean absolution on demand. I hope you're safe, I said. I am, she replied, but I don't think I ever was before. That was the closest we came to reconciliation, and for now, it was enough. I returned to my life with a different kind of clarity. Work felt sharper, choices felt cleaner. I stopped second-guessing instincts I'd learned to doubt when I was younger. The part of me that used to freeze under pressure had learned something important. It had survived. The calls stopped. The messages never came. Whatever strategy he'd relied on before had collapsed under exposure, and without silence to protect it, it couldn't rebuild itself. Control requires cooperation, and I had withdrawn mine completely. Sometimes late at night I thought about the girl I'd been when I left. How small she felt. How convinced she was that disappearing was the only form of safety available to her. I didn't judge her for that anymore. She did what she needed to do with the tools she had, but I also honored the woman I became afterward. The one who learned that distance wasn't the same as freedom, and that the real turning point came when I stopped running and started seeing clearly. Revenge isn't loud, not the kind that lasts. It doesn't always look like confrontation or victory speeches or dramatic endings. Sometimes it looks like refusing to sign, like asking one more question, like staying calm when someone expects fear. Sometimes it looks like walking away without explaining yourself one last time. I don't pretend that what happened didn't leave marks. It did. But those marks no longer define the outline of my life. They're part of its texture now, not its shape. And that matters. If you're listening to this and you've ever been told to keep the peace at the cost of your own safety, I want you to hear something clearly. Silence doesn't make abuse smaller. It makes it quieter. And quiet is where it survives. You don't owe loyalty to anyone who uses fear as a management tool. You don't owe forgiveness to someone who never took responsibility. And you don't owe access to your life to people who only want it when it benefits them. Walking away isn't weakness. Coming back informed isn't cruelty. And refusing to be used is not betrayal. It's self-respect. If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who tried to control the narrative of your life? Or maybe you're still deciding whether to leave stay silent or finally ask the questions you've been avoiding. Share what you're comfortable with in the comments. You never know who might see it and feel less alone. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about boundaries, justice, and the quiet kind of strength that changes everything, make sure you subscribe and stay with us here. There are more voices that deserve to be heard and more truths worth telling. Thank you for listening.